I'm delighted to welcome John Milbank, Professor Emeritus at the University of Nottingham. I do not think Professor Milbank needs much of an introduction, as he is very well known as the founding figure of radical orthodoxy. And whether or not one resonates with radical orthodoxy or is a critic, it is rather hard to deny that radical orthodoxy has set forward very many important questions that Christian thinkers are having to contend with one way or another. So, Professor Milbank, I thank you for joining us and offering a few words on our conference, which we're putting on this spring at the St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth on the theme of the future of Christian thinking. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Good. A pleasure likewise. So let me just begin, John, by saying that I know that you have given guest lectures here at St. Patrick's Pontifical University. I believe it was in 2019, just before I came to this university. Just curious, is there anything that you're in particular looking forward to coming back to or experiencing again in visiting Maynooth?
Yes, very much. I absolutely love Maynooth. It's just a small place, like a village with a university. It strikes me as ideal. You can just wander from the seminar to the pub, and it has the kind of relaxed atmosphere that I associate with my early days in a university in a small town, when people are mainly interested in discussion and friendship in a Socratic atmosphere, and it's fairly relaxed, and there aren't too many rules, and achievement and competition is not the last word. I don't think the modern university is like that anymore, and I think if Ireland and Irish culture is able to sustain that, it's fantastic. And I felt that that was being sustained when I went to Maynooth. And of course, the chapel is one of the finest neo-Gothic buildings anywhere in these islands.
It is.
It's absolutely fantastic. And to me, is a kind of reminder that there isn't a huge gulf between Irish and English culture, that there's a shared insular style, if you like, and this is so indebted to Pugin, but it's by an Irish architect, and it has a beautiful cosmic vision that to me sort of evokes Arugula, and it is so unlike perhaps the kind of narrow-minded Catholicism that the Irish have rather rejected, and of course they've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. But maybe Maynooth is the place that can give them a better vision and a longer, deeper vision of Irish Catholic identity.
Yes. Well, thank you for those kind words. For those of you that will be coming to the conference, I think one of the greatest experiences you'll have is precisely as John has highlighted, is the chapel. It is glorious. We're looking forward to welcoming you here, John, and we will have. I think we're planning on having high vespers in the chapel. So
that would be just lovely.
Lovely. Okay, so moving on a little bit. As you know, and our viewers know, the theme of the conference is the future of Christian thinking. Now, I think we intentionally left the theme to be rather broad, but we also wanted to be looking and straining forward into the future, because it is very clear that the future of Christianity and of Christian thought, it's hazy, it's nebulous. The challenges facing Christianity are multifaceted. So perhaps you could just say a few words on the timeliness of the theme, again, namely the future of Christian thinking.
Well, I think it's very timely because Christianity isn't going to go away. It's an absolutely huge presence in the world, and if it's in decline, then you could say that most intellectual movements and cultural associative movements are also in decline. But even if Christianity is becoming an increasingly minority thing, I think that the energy and the ideas are still there. But I think that this is a timely crisis because there's it's not a good institutional situation now for theology. You know, its future within the university is very, very uncertain. We probably need new institutional carapaces for the carrying forward of theology. But I think that gives us a chance to ask just what theology is. You know, how far have our assumptions about what theology is been shaped by the secular university and the requirements of the secular university? In some ways, in a country like France, where it hasn't been allowed in secular universities, it's almost encouraged a more dynamic interaction between theology and philosophy and the human sciences and the natural sciences and so on. You know, suggesting that somehow if you abolish theology, perhaps it breaks out everywhere, as Cardinal Newman once said. But it does, I think, give us a chance to reconsider what the theological enterprise is, even whether it should be called theology, whether a lot of the divisions with philosophy or the way we break up theology internally as a discipline, whether all that can't actually come into question in some way. And I think also, you know, should the future of theology be more deliberately ecumenical is also a question. Yeah, you know, can any Christian church, you know, lay an absolute claim to the monopoly of the inheritance? And I'm thinking here particularly perhaps of the relationship between Catholicism and the Eastern churches, and then again to the Oriental churches. You know, all the churches, if we sort of bracket the Reformation for the moment, you know, all the churches that have that patristic legacy, you know, can we be so sure that theology should simply pursue itself in relation to one of those legacies, ignoring the others? And to some extent, that has already stopped happening. But should it be taken further, I think, is also a question.
Yes, excellent. Can I pick up just before I move on to the last question? Can I pick up on one of the points that you made? So the conference being put on here is being put on by the Faculty of Philosophy at St. Patrick's College. However, as anybody that looks at the program, they see that many theologians are speaking at our conference, and so that division between philosophy and theology, and certainly part of the approach of this conference is that we need that transdisciplinary approach, and that those who are able to philosophize better are the ones that can theologize, and those that can theologize can also philosophize. So a few words perhaps on that, John?
Well, I think we need to approach this question in the most radical way possible without necessarily assuming we'll come to radical questions. But I think you need to begin by asking, well, should there be a division between theology and philosophy at all? Did it exist historically? Did it perhaps only really start to exist in the 13th century, and maybe under the impact of Arabic thought, or a certain strands within Arabic thought, where a duality between theology and teaching based on the Quran was much more central. And have Christians taken on something that's not really completely appropriate to them, even in the case of Aquinas. The idea there are two theologies, a theology of philosophy and Sacra Doctrina. It doesn't seem to exist in the previous Boethian tradition. And in fact, when you get to Meister Eckhart, he goes back to that Boethian tradition of unity. That Eckhart is, in this respect, the conservative compared to Aquinas. And then that kind of unity is taken forward again by Nicholas Cusa. In De Docta Ignorantia is you could say a philosophical text, but it's got Christology right at its heart. And then when we look at the 19th century, as John-Yves Lacoste said, the really creative, great thinkers seem to be the ones who fuse theology and philosophy. Hegel, Schelling, Kierkegaard, and in the case that you could argue that's really going on even with Heidegger, that Heidegger achieves a strange blend of Protestant and Catholic theology, and then calls it atheist philosophy, in a way that's at once creative and also dubious, perhaps. And we can only interrogate that, I think, if we raise these questions about the relationship between philosophy and theology. Should philosophy be swallowing up theology, or can we have a completely different approach to their integration? And of course, having invoked Islam, there's also a sort of positive interreligious dimension to that. There are other discourses within Islam. We think of Ibn al-Arabi or Mullah Sadra, where they are more integrated. And I think this also has a sort of political dimension, if you like. That sometimes, if you look back in the 30s. You find rather sinister texts where people say, well, Jews can't fit into our society because Christians secularize politics, whereas Jews don't do that. And even more, that might be true about Islam. And there's a real danger there of slipping into a sort of racism in a religious disguise, if you like, because while I think it's true, and I've said so myself, that we have to be honest that Islam has a different take on the relationship of the political, and it's a question whether they can fit in. You could also sort of exaggerate this, that in the Christian past, canon law was very important. Our politics, our whole political legacy are really profoundly marked by the gospel. And perhaps it's more accurate to say that we've inherited a distinction of the church and the state, and certainly a non-sacralization of law and politics, but nonetheless a strong sense from Augustine, in other words, that the test of a just politics is: does it encourage the gospel? Does it encourage the life of communion and reconciliation, which is the church? So I think that one reason for looking at the integration of theology and philosophy is, as I say, an interreligious one, that not just Islam, but also Eastern thought doesn't have that same kind of separation. And we're now in an ironic situation where you find philosophy departments in England, in the name of globalization, they're teaching Hindu philosophy and so on. But, they wouldn't teach Christian theology, even though we can argue that if we're looking at Augustine, he sees this as Christian philosophy. Not, the category of theology hasn't really been invented yet. So, as I say, we're not going to necessarily change everything or all agree, but I think this is an open question.
Yes, yeah. No, that's excellent. I mean, it's precisely open, and I mean, these are the kinds of things that we're hoping to explore with quite a few diverse voices at the upcoming conference. One of which is certainly yours. So my concluding question is concerning your paper. it's a very it's a very tantalizing paper title, and I think you have a way of sort of doing that, and it could be read in different ways by just hearing it. Well, what exactly do you mean? So your paper topic that we have is theology beyond theology, radicalizing orthodoxy. So maybe just rather briefly, give us a bit of a teaser on what you intend to speak about at Maynooth.
Well, I think by beyond theology, I'm referring to what I've already invoked. You would have a discourse that is at once theology and philosophy, and developing, for example, something like a Trinitarian ontology, as many people have already tried to do, and a Christological ontology as well as included in that, so that it instead of saying, well, we have an account of being, and maybe we have an account of the one God and the creator God, and then peculiar Christian doctrines are sort of add-ons to that, and you fit them into the space. Instead of that, your whole account of being can be Trinitarian and Christological. So, exponents of that in the past would be, well, certainly Maximus, but also in certain ways Malebranche in the 17th century in the Oratorian tradition, and then Antonio Rosmini in the 19th century. And those are all people I'm trying to reread at the moment. By radicalizing orthodoxy, I'm suggesting, in a sense, a new chapter in radical orthodoxy, where you reconsider the people who are often considered to have, as it were, gone too far, and I'm thinking particularly of Origen, of Arugula, of Eckhart, Nicholas of Cusa, and also some people that are often described as esotericists since the Renaissance. But I think there are strong arguments for saying are actually sort of truer to a patristic vision than anybody else. So these are not liberals, I think. They're people pushing the logic of orthodoxy itself, but for many people pushing too far. And I think I'm wanting to suggest that they're not pushing too far. And I think very briefly, they're people prepared to ignore the paradoxes, particularly the paradoxes of God's relationship to the creation. How can you have, if God is absolute, how can you have something besides the absolute, to put it very, very simply? And then I think a mark of all these thinkers is that they don't allow the doctrines of the Trinity or of the Incarnation to compromise the divine unity and simplicity. That seems to me that many other thinkers, and even the people who most of the time get it right, like Augustine and Aquinas, there are points where they're in danger of doing that. So maybe of talking of God too much as if he makes choices or punishes, for example. And so I'm wanting to push the question of whether the people who are more, if you like, radically henological are, after all, actually truer to the Bible, and by being apparently more Neoplatonic, are truer to monotheism. And we get an awful lot of things wrong here, like the idea that Plotinus is one, has no will, and is completely impersonal, and all this sort of thing. They say in textbooks that's actually not the case. So in a way, by asking that question, I'm trying to do something grandly ecumenical. We're moving into a Eurasian era, into an era of, the Silk Route, if you like, and there's going to be an awful lot of recovery and reconsideration of the interactions between the West and the East. And you could say that there's from the East, we get, broadly speaking, despite all the variations, a focus on monism. The idea that we need to transcend our isolated individualities and desires by discovering we are all one. And then, of course, you have, in the case of the East, and then more obviously in the Near East, you have monotheism. Mm-hmm. So I'm wanting to suggest that somehow the peculiarities of Christianity don't deny either monism or monotheism. Instead, that Trinity and Christology are the ways of thinking through and resolving the paradoxes emerging from that. And of course, taking into account that this only happens, through a process of living, of receiving divine light, events, and so on, and not trying to deny that. And in that sense, I'm wanting to revisit the questions raised by Hegel, but without necessarily, in the end, agreeing with Hegel. But I do think that then takes you to a position of linking the Trinity with the outgoing of creation and the return to God, without any notion that God in himself becomes, but nonetheless a sense that process is that expression of what God does belong to God eternally. And I think similarly, if God has become incarnate, that can't be something that's happened to him. So in a sense, the incarnation reveals that God is incarnate. It happens, but equally it reveals that to be the case. Otherwise, you're denying the simplicity of God. And I also, I think, agree with both Maximus and Malebranche that we can only understand how there could be something beside God if in the end that thing is also fully God or brought into God in the incarnation in such a way that allows the separateness to stand and yet also cancels it in some sense of a personal unity. And finally, well, just two other points really. I want to link that to a question of reopening the question of the canon. So if there's a Eurasian dimension, we've also got to get away from a purely white theology, not in a ridiculous way of, all these kind of theologies of identity that are going on at the moment that, just give way to scientism and capitalism, but in a much more serious sense that, the Ethiopian take on our universal situation and the entire, current thought of the Oriental churches has perhaps not been taken seriously enough. And I think that includes the idea that both the Nestorian and Monophysite churches can't so easily be seen as not orthodox because certain Christological issues are just not really resolved. And then in the case of the Ethiopian church, it's got this incredibly ancient Bible that is much bigger than our Bible. And we just ignore this issue. And in particular, it includes things like the Book of Enoch. And maybe if you include the Book of Enoch, you naturally read the New Testament differently. You see that it's very close to the Book of Enoch. For example, what I've already talked about, the idea that the incarnation is disclosing something that is internally the case, is encouraged if you read the Book of Enoch, along with several other emphases, including ones that are extraordinarily pertinent to us today. This apparent similarity to the Promethean theme, that there are angels who've ambivalent angels who've given away secrets to us that are dubious and that are linked to technology. But Christ, or the foreshadowing of Christ, that one sees in the Book of Enoch is the divine secret that trumps that, so that I think our ability to debate certain modern issues increases if we look at this the question of whether we have embraced as revelation enough, I think. And then finally, I want also to raise the question of theological education in the age we enter into theological education, because it seems to me that really right from the outset, and this was a good thing, Christians accepted an element of antique humanism. So we had the idea at the elementary level where you learn your grammar, you study the Latin and the Greek classics, and then theology comes later. And we could contrast that with the Jewish and the Islamic legacy. But has this sort of encouraged too much of a sense of duality in our Christian culture? Do we perhaps need to consider the idea that right from the outset of our schooling, we would be looking at in terms of humanities at the classical legacy, but also at the Jewish and the biblical legacy, and that might start to give us a different kind of cultural outcome, and again at the same time, by paradoxically insisting on our particularity, as with Christology and the Trinity, at the same time showing a certain greater similarity with respect to an integral view of things that other religious cultures also have. So I want to raise this question of a kind of a big resetting of the position of theology in our culture.
Excellent, John. Thank you so much for that expansive overview of an exciting and no doubt controversial topic. We most certainly look forward to hearing the fullness of it as you deliver your paper at the end of April. And I thank you very much for taking the time today to offer these words and to give us a little bit, opening the curtain just a little bit on what it is that you intend to speak upon in a very almost visionary manner. And as always, it's a pleasure. And I thank you very much for taking the time to do this.
Thanks, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Okay.
See you soon. Okay.
Yes.